Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life and untimely death of Brenda Sue Schaefer. Brenda was born on the 25th of April 1952. She was the sixth and youngest child of Essie and John Schaefer, a Catholic family from Louisville, Kentucky. Brenda was a shy child who grew into a more outgoing adult. In 1971, when Brenda was 19 years old, disaster struck the Schaefer family. This happened when Brenda's older brother, Jack, a police detective, was killed, alongside another detective called Wilbur Hayes. The two detectives were trying to arrest two men for the burglary of a roofing company when they were fatally shot. The perpetrators were on the run for several days before being identified and caught. They were brothers, Narvel and William Tinsley, who were both tried, convicted and received life sentences. After postponing her wedding due to her brother's death, Brenda married her childhood sweetheart in late 1971. The marriage broke down amicably after around 4 years, mainly because the pair felt that they were too young to be married. Brenda began working as an assistant for Dr. William Spaulding in his medical practice. She was smart, efficient and worked hard, and was popular with both her colleagues and the patients. She owned a condo in DuPont Square on the outskirts of Louisville, but by the mid-1980s had moved back to her childhood home on nearby Warner Avenue in order to take care of her parents. Her mother, Essie, was seriously ill, having been diagnosed with lupus and heart problems, which were even further complicated when she suffered a stroke. On the 24th of September 1986, Brenda went on a blind date with a man by the name of Melvin Henry Ignatow. Melvin was a successful businessman who was 14 years older than Brenda and already had 3 adult children from previous relationships. The pair soon began dating, and on Valentine's Day 1987, Melvin proposed to Brenda with a 2.3 carat custom designed diamond ring. At this time, their relationship appeared perfect, but by the following year, this had completely deteriorated. Despite being caring and attentive at first, Melvin had become increasingly abusive towards Brenda, and by the summer of 1988, Brenda's usually upbeat demeanour had completely changed. She had told her brother, Tom, as well as some of her work colleagues, that she was planning to break off her engagement to Melvin. On the evening of the 24th of September 1988, the 2-year anniversary of their first date, Brenda and Melvin met up. At 3:30 a.m. the following morning, Brenda's mother, Essie, phoned Melvin as she was concerned that Brenda had not returned home. This was completely out of character for Brenda, who would always phone her parents if she was going to be late to prevent them from worrying. Melvin told Essie that he and Brenda had spent the evening together talking about their wedding plans over dinner at the Gold Star Chili restaurant in Hikes Point before window shopping at the Oxmoor Centre. They then drove to River Road, where they spent some time walking alongside the river. Brenda then dropped Melvin at his home on Florian Road at around 11:30 p.m. before heading home to her parents' house. At around 4 a.m. on Sunday the 25th of September, Brenda's brother Tom contacted the police to report that his sister was missing. Around 2 hours later, a police officer spotted Brenda's car. It was a white 1984 Buick Regal. The car was on the side of a busy road less than half a mile away from her house. The rear window was smashed and the passenger door was unlocked. One of the tyres was punctured, the radio was missing, and someone had tried unsuccessfully to remove the speakers. The officer also noted that the car was covered in dew, indicating that it had been stationary for several hours. A massive police investigation soon followed. A small amount of O-positive blood was found in the car. This was a match to Brenda's blood type, but this could not be conclusively identified as hers. Divers searched the Ohio River, but without any success. Brenda's family, together with her employer, Dr. William Spaulding, offered a $25,000 reward for information, but sadly this only resulted in the police receiving hoax calls. Numerous interviews were conducted, and whilst the police lacked any definitive evidence, they focused on one main suspect, Melvin. Whilst Melvin claimed that he and Brenda were happy, in love, and planning their wedding, those who were close to Brenda stated that she was ending the relationship because of his abusive behaviour. Melvin declared that the reports of their relationship having deteriorated was simply vicious gossip, and he was vocal about his resentment of the police. He complained that people now treated him differently due to the police interest, and stated that the police were victimising an innocent man who was already devastated by the loss of a loved one. Despite him being eager to clear his name, he was steadfast in his refusal to take a polygraph test, stating that he believed them to be unreliable. With no physical evidence against Melvin and no trace of Brenda, there was little that the police could do. A year after the disappearance, they were still no closer to finding Brenda or arresting the man who they believed was responsible. In August 1989, Brenda's boss, William Spaulding, was charged with sending Melvin a letter containing a death threat if he continued to refuse to admit what had happened to Brenda. The case went to trial and Melvin testified against William in court. William was convicted of a misdemeanor and fined $300. 2 months later, in October 1989, the police played into Melvin's clear thirst for publicity by inviting him to clear his name once and for all by testifying in front of a grand jury. During his testimony, Melvin mentioned his ex-girlfriend, Mary Ann Shaw. Mary had dated Melvin for 10 years prior to him dating Brenda, and her name had never come up in relation to the crime before Melvin's testimony. As a result of this, the police brought in 39-year-old Mary for questioning. Mary eventually broke down and told the police what had happened that night. Several weeks before Brenda's disappearance, Melvin had got in touch with Mary. He told her that Brenda was planning on leaving him and that he would not allow it. Together, Mary and Melvin meticulously planned the details of Brenda's murder to ensure that they would not get caught. They decided that Brenda would be killed at Mary's house and then buried in the wasteland behind. Brenda would be tortured first, with Melvin reportedly making a list of all the things which he would do to her. Mary and Melvin spent weeks making extensive preparations, including digging the grave and scream testing the house. This meant Melvin stood at the side of the road whilst Mary screamed so that they could be confident that they would not be overheard. On the night of the 24th of September 1988, Brenda had agreed to meet up with Melvin to return some jewellery following their breakup. Once they met, Melvin took Brenda to Mary's house in Poplar Level Road at gunpoint. Brenda was locked in the house, stripped, blindfolded, gagged, and tied to a glass coffee table. Melvin then physically and sexually assaulted her, whilst Mary took photographs. Once Melvin had completed his checklist of torture, he killed Brenda with chloroform. Mary and Melvin then took Brenda's jewellery before wrapping her body in rubbish bags, bound her with rope, and burying her in the grave which they had prepared. They neatly folded her clothes and buried them in a separate bag. Mary led the police to where Brenda's body had been buried. Due to the level of decomposition, it was not possible to gain any forensic evidence to link the murder to Melvin. There were, however, signs that she had been tortured, which corresponded with Mary's version of the events of the night of the 24th of September. Still without any solid evidence against Melvin, the police made a deal with Mary. She was told that she would only be charged with tampering with the evidence, a minor crime, if she helped secure sufficient evidence against Melvin. Mary agreed to this, and on January 9th, 1990, she met with Melvin in a parking lot of Erla's ice cream store. She was recording their conversation. She told Melvin how the FBI were hounding her and that the land behind her house was now up for sale. Melvin responded that he was not worried as, "That place we dug is not shallow." Based on this recording, on the 10th of January 1990, Melvin was charged with Brenda's attack and murder. Soon after Brenda's body was discovered, her 74-year-old mother, Essie, died. Brenda's father, John, who was 77, died the following year. Family members believe that their deaths were at least in part down to the heartbreak of losing their youngest daughter. Melvin's case went to trial in late 1971, having been moved from Louisville to Kenton County, where it had attracted far less publicity. As part of her deal, Mary testified on behalf of the prosecution and the wiretapes were brought into evidence. The defence, however, claimed that Melvin and Brenda had a loving relationship and suggested that Mary was jealous and had killed Brenda herself. Melvin did not testify, although his mother, sister and 3 children all took the stand to testify on his behalf. On the 22nd of December 1991, after deliberations of just over 6 hours, the jury returned their verdict. Melvin was found not guilty of every one of the charges. The jury stated that they had no evidence linking him to the murder. They did not feel that Mary was a credible witness, and they believed that she clearly had a great deal of animosity towards Melvin. Mary had acted strangely throughout the trial, often laughing inappropriately, which damaged her credibility further. The jury also thought that the tapes were inconclusive. Brenda's name was never mentioned, and they concluded that Melvin and Mary could easily have been talking about a buried safe as opposed to a buried body. The result was so shocking that the judge wrote a letter of apology to Brenda's family following the verdict. Melvin was released in time for Christmas, whilst Mary was convicted of tampering charges and served 3 years of her 5-year term. Brenda's family were understandably devastated. In order to fund his defence costs, Melvin had to sell his house. On the 1st of October 1992, the new residents were replacing the hallway carpet. When the old carpet was removed, the carpet fitter found a plastic bag taped to the inside of a previously concealed floor vent. The plastic bag contained jewellery and 3 rolls of undeveloped film. The items were passed to the authorities and the photographs developed. They contained over 100 images of Brenda being sexually assaulted and much more worse. Although the assailant's face was not visible, he could be identified by hair and mole patterns. It was Melvin Ignatow. Due to his not guilty verdict, Melvin was now protected by the double jeopardy rule. This prevents a person being prosecuted twice for the same crime, no matter what the circumstances. The intention of this rule is to protect the innocent from unfair persecution, but in this case, this rule was clearly protecting a monster. The following day, knowing that he could not be prosecuted again, Melvin confessed to Brenda's murder. He apologised to Brenda's family, and despite the photographic evidence to the contrary, claimed that he ensured that she had a peaceful death. Melvin was charged with perjury for lying to the jury and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. However, with 2 years already served and a year off for good behaviour, he was a free man once again just 5 years later. In 2001, it was reported that he was living in a run-down apartment, surviving on disability checks for a number of illnesses. By this time he claimed to be a born-again Christian and spent his time at church and volunteering to feed the homeless. Late in 2001, Melvin faced more perjury charges, this time for the fake testimony which he had given at the trial of Brenda's employer, Dr. William Spaulding. This was the case regarding the threatening letter. Following his conviction, the doctor's life had also dramatically changed. He was barred from private practice and took a job in a Jefferson County Health Department clinic. He became increasingly concerned for his safety and began carrying a gun. He subsequently lost his medical privileges for bringing the gun onto hospital property. William died in 1996 and was buried in Cave Hill Cemetery, about 250 metres from Brenda. Although prosecuting Melvin for perjury in this way caused some controversy, due to it being argued that it was simply a way to bypass the double jeopardy rule, it was decided by the Kentucky Supreme Court that it could be done. Melvin was convicted and served another 5 years in prison. He was released in December 2006, after which he returned to live in Louisville, just 4 miles from where he had killed Brenda. Mary, who had been released from prison in 1995, died in 2004 at the age of 54. She was survived by her husband. On the 1st of September 2008, Melvin was found dead in his apartment on Terrier Road by a neighbour. He had accidentally fallen into a glass coffee table, injuring his head and arm. A blood trail was found where he had tried to make his way into the kitchen. The neighbour described him as a sick, elderly man who had been struggling for help as he bled to death. That concludes today's story. It was suggested by One Too Much. Please let me know any comments or any thoughts about the case. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye.